Good morning, everybody. We've got a very large number of people who've signed up for this webinar this morning, so we'll just give it a few more minutes. We've got quite a lot of people who've already joined, but I can see that more and more people are joining. So we'll just give it a moment too longer and then start the webinar. Okay, well, the numbers have now settled down, and so one or two more people I think will join, but I think most people who are intending to join have done so. So let me first of all welcome everybody to this webinar. It's the Heat Networks Regulations Update, as you can see on the screen there. Thank you very much for joining us. Just a little bit of housekeeping. All attendees are muted. We would like you to put questions to the speakers, and in fact we've decided we'll keep the talks slightly shorter than usual so that we have more time for speakers, in particular because Tom Penson is here from the Office for Product Safety and Standards, and he may well be able to answer specific questions for people. Just to let you know, the webinar is being recorded and we will share the recording and the slides afterwards. So what I'd like to do first of all is to welcome our speakers. First of all, Tom Penson, as I said, the enforcement team lead at the Office for Product Safety and Standards, and that is the enforcement of the Heat Network regulations, the metering and billing regulations, that is, of course. And he'll be talking about the update, the building classes and crucial dates as well. It probably won't have escaped people's attention from the invitation that we have a crucial date on the 27th of this month, so not very far away. He'll be followed by Ian Allen, Head of Marketing Strategy at Switch 2. He's going to talk about the paybacks and mitigation of increasing gas prices. And then there's myself, Colin Hall, partner at Winkworth Sherwood. I deal with the heating arrangements and the commercial elements. And so I'm going to be talking about those commercial arrangements that will be affected and may be used perhaps in order to make sure that schemes remain viable. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Tom for his talk. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, Colin. As Colin said, my name's Thomas Penson. I am the enforcement team leader in OPSS on the Heat Network metering and billing regulations, which I'll be talking to you about today. We're going to do a quick talk about building classes and, as a reminder for everyone, run through some of the key requirements of the regs and also look at some of the key dates that are coming up in the near future. So if we can move on to the next slide, please. We can go on to the next one now as well. So just a quick reminder of the key requirements in the regulation. So there's four main requirements in the regs. And the first one is that heat suppliers must register their heat networks as the notification process. Heat suppliers must also install metering devices in certain circumstances. And then any metering devices that are installed, heat suppliers must ensure that they are accurate. And if they are installed on the network, they must ensure that customers are billed based on the actual consumption shown on those devices. So if we go to the next slide, we'll talk about building classes. So a part of the amendments that happened last year in November, the concept of building classes was introduced to the regs. The regulations now describe criteria for 3 different building classes for heat suppliers to consider. This is the viable, the exempt, and the open classes. And heat suppliers need to determine the class of each of the buildings on each of the networks that they run. This information is then reported on the notification template when your next notification will occur. As was mentioned earlier, there is a key date coming up, which is the 27th of November this year. And by that date, heat suppliers must have determined what building class each of the buildings on their networks are, and where appropriate, complete a cost effectiveness tool, which we'll come to a little later on. It's quite important to note that unlike for notifications, building classes is a building by building concept. So on a single network, you could have multiple different building classes happening, and a determination for one building on a network does not reflect the determination of another building on a network. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide, we'll start looking at the building classes. So the next couple of slides are a few tables that I've taken from our guidance documents. This document's available on our website. A link is in the slide pack, which you'll be sent around, I think, at the end of the presentation. It'll also be on, you'll be able to see it at the end when we get to there. I like to think about the building class by talking about the exempt class first, because it tends to be the one that people are most interested in, because the exempt class means that you don't need to install meters. It doesn't mean you're exempt from the regulations themselves, it's just the meter installation part. So notification is still required if you fall within the exempt class. The thing to note about the exempt class is generally it doesn't apply to new buildings. The only section that applies to new buildings is communal heating that's been newly constructed and is not consisting mainly of private dwellings and connected to communal heating on or after the 27th of November, where the heat is distributed by means other than hot water or cooling other than a transfer fluid other than water. In every other instance, the same requirements are there for the exempt class. So a building would fall into the exempt class if any part of the building is supported housing, arms house accommodation, or purpose-built student accommodation. There are some criteria for supported housing, which is available in the regulations themselves and in our guidance documents. The second main part of the exempt class is the lease clause. So in an existing building where you have more than 10% of the total number of private or non-domestic premises there need to have a leasehold interest, which restricts billing based on consumption, and this lease needs to have been in place before the 27th of November 2020, which is when the amendments came in. The third strand of the exempt class is an existing building that doesn't consist mainly of private dwellings, where heat is distributed by means other than hot water, or cooling is done using a transfer fluid other than water. These 3 different parts of the exempt class, it's not required to meet all 3 of them. If you meet one of them, your building will fall into the exempt class. So if you meet the leasehold interest, it will fall into the exempt class, or if you have supported housing, it will fall into the exempt class. It's not a case you need to meet all 3 pillars. Okay, so next, if we move on to the next slide, we'll talk about the viable class. The reason I like to do it in this order is because once you've got rid of the exempt ones and you look at the viable ones, which are generally quite easy to work out, everything else generally falls into the open class. And that's quite a nice way of thinking about building classes, in my opinion. So the viable class is mainly new buildings. So you'll notice if you look at the table, there's very little existing buildings written on there. And the only existing buildings are buildings that undergo a major renovation on a district heat network relating to the technical services after the amendments came in, or anything where meter installation would have previously been mandatory under the regulations prior to the amendments happening. In all other instances, newly constructed buildings on communal or district systems that are built after the 27th of November or come online after the 1st of September next year will fall into the viable class. Essentially, what the viable class means is that you have to install meters. There's no cost effectiveness attached to it. There's no technical argument attached to it, and meters need to be installed on these buildings. And there's no other way around it. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll look at the open class. So this is pretty much everything else. So the majority of buildings will fall into the open class. So it's buildings that exist already that don't meet any of the exemptions we previously talked about. This generally is where most people's buildings will fall into, and it's in these classes where you need to install meters unless you can show it's cost effective not to do so. It's not cost effective to do so, sorry, or it's not technically feasible to do so. So this is where the majority of buildings will fall, and it's where the majority of work will happen around meter installation. If you fall into this class, you'll need to consider doing a cost effectiveness test, which is where this deadline of the 27th of November comes in. So if we move on to the next slide, we'll talk about the cost effectiveness test. So if you fall into the open class, you must complete a cost effectiveness test. You must install meters unless you can show it's not cost effective to do so or technically feasible to do so. The test that has been created by Bayes and is available on our website to download. There's two versions of this test. There's a full version and a reduced version. The reduced version is for people that have energy consumption data for a building and a quote for meter installation, and the full version is for where that information is not available. There's a full guidance document available on our website which explains each of the different categories on that test. There is also a webinar that we did back in February where we did a step-by-step walkthrough of the tools, and a link to that is available at the end of this presentation as well. It's important to note that the test operates on a building level rather than a network level, so it will look at the individual requirements of each building you have on your network. Okay, so that's the main thing we need to focus on for going forward in the short term, because that's the deadline that's coming up on November the 27th this year. I'm just going to do a quick run through of some of the other things in the regs. So if we move on to the next slide, the notification process still exists. Heat suppliers must notify the Office of Product Safety and Standards of all the networks they operate, and the notification template is available on our website, which is detailed there. And we have a mailbox for notifications, which is detailed there as well. If you move on to the next slide, what I will explain is we're currently in a transitional period, which came in with the amendments to the regulations. So any notifications that were due between the 27th of November 2020 and September the 1st, 2022, they don't have to be completed till the end of this transitional period in September 2022. If a notification was due before 27th of November 2020, it's still due. So I would encourage you to get that in as soon as possible. We have started taking enforcement action on the notification process. And we are looking at trying to increase the number of notifications that we should have received through this enforcement action. If we move on to the next slide, I'll briefly talk about meter accuracy. So it's not a new concept that was brought in with the amendments. It's something that's always existed in the regulations. It applies to all meters installed on heat networks, and all meters that are installed from the date of the amendments, 27th of November 2020, must comply with this requirement, and any meters installed prior to that date must comply with it before the 1st of September 2022, and there's detailed recommendations available in our guidance documents. Next slide, please. So key dates. So this is the most important thing really we'll talk about today. So the date that's coming up is the 27th of November 2021. So by this date, heat suppliers should have determined what building classes their buildings fall into and completed any relevant cost effectiveness tests. Where the cost effectiveness test is required to be completed by the first deadline, it's an obligation in the regulations, but non-completion does not contribute to an offence. It's not a detailed offence in the regs, but failing to complete a cost effectiveness test by the first deadline will have an impact on the ability of the heat supplier to meet other obligations, such as meter installation by the 1st of September 2022. So if a heat supplier fails to complete a cost effectiveness test in time and then subsequently fails to install heat meters or heat cost allocators in time, then they could be liable for penalties under Regulation 13 in relation to Regulations 4 and 6. OPSS, we urge all heat suppliers to complete the cost effectiveness well in advance, so as soon as possible at this point, and to contact OPSS if they encounter any issues in meeting the requirement. If it doesn't need to be submitted to OPSS, but it must be completed and retained, and they must be submitted to OPSS on request, and we reserve the right to ask for the cost effectiveness assessment and any other supporting evidence necessary to verify the requirement not to install metering devices or not to install metering devices. As you can see on the slide, there's a second deadline, which is the 1st September 2022, and by this point, heat suppliers must have complied with all of the amended and new requirements in the regulations and the existing requirements in the regulations, and this could be to install metering devices in all buildings that it's technically feasible and cost effective to do so in the open class or in the viable class as they become live. Temperature control devices must also be installed where required, and this is indicated on the cost effectiveness tool as well. They must also comply with the meter accuracy requirements and submit a new notification if it's required. And after this date, compliance with all requirements and regulations will apply. What I will say is that if you fail to meet this first deadline of completing the cost effectiveness test by 27th of November, and then subsequently fail to install meters by the 1st of September 2022, then there's very little we can do with working with people to come back into compliance, because you wouldn't have met multiple parts of the requirements of the regs. So I would encourage people as soon as possible to get that cost effectiveness test done. And if we move on to the next slide, this is all of the available help we've got. So our website's there, it has guidance, it has the notification template and the cost effectiveness tool and guidance to go along with that. And there's links to the regulations. That email address is our OPSS email address, which is there for inquiries and for regarding regulations, and also submitting notification template and the cost effectiveness tool if you feel you want to submit that for us to look at. And then that final one is just a link to a YouTube page, which has got the recordings of the webinars we did in February 2021. If you're struggling with the cost effectiveness tool, I'd encourage you to have a look there, because there's quite a detailed walkthrough of the cost effectiveness tool that was done by one of the people that created the tool. And it can go into a lot more detail than I can in a short amount of time. So with that, I'm going to say thank you for listening, and I'll take any questions and when we get to that part of the presentation today, but I will hand back now. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Tom. That was very interesting. And in fact, one question that I think will come out at the end, I hope anyway, is what shape does enforcement take? It might be useful for people to know what you're currently doing. Anyway, before all of that, two more talks. So first of all, Ian Allen of Switch 2, I'll hand over to you now, Ian. Many thanks.
Unmute. Okay, hi. You can hear me now. My name's Ian Allen from Switch 2. I'm going to talk to you about two aspects of installing meters. One is the reduction in demand through behavioural change, and the other one is how installing meters might mitigate the impact of gas price rises due to the energy crisis. So Switch 2, for those of you who don't know, we have been in heat networks, operating exclusively in heat networks for over 40 years. We provide metering and billing and customer services, operational services, maintenance of heat networks, and optimizing heat networks, and also design, build and ESCO services. So we will adopt heat networks and operate them, taking the risks for the long-term periods. We work exclusively in heat networks, so that's our main focus of our business. So why install meters? As I said, I'm going to talk about the case study. I'm going to talk about a case study where we installed meters into a retirement home and the effect of the effect that had on consumption. And I'm also going to look at the paybacks around installing meters and how the increasing gas prices will affect those. So behavioural change, what does this mean for CO2 savings? Well, I'm going to show you on the next couple of slides, give you the figures that we see. But of course, behavioural change means really residents are starting to turn down their heat, closing their windows, turning off their heating when it's not needed. So using what they need rather than what they can, which is what they generally do on a flat rate charge scheme. So this is a retirement complex in Hull, this case study that I'm going to show you. It's relatively unusual, and it's unusual because we install the meters and then we didn't switch the metering and billing on until after a year. So I'll explain that now. And I've split it into 3 periods to help me explain it to you. Period A, that was when the meters were installed and the heating system was upgraded with meters. And at the time, the residents were paying a flat rate charge of £9.60 per week. Period B was when the meters were switched on, and it was a year that the meters were switched on, and the first year of our analysis, the meters were operational and the data was collected, but the residents were still paying a £9.60 per week flat rate charge. It wasn't until period C when the meters, the residents were actually billed based on their metered consumption. So I'm going to show you the results of that 2-year period of analysis now. So here are the results. The average weekly consumption during period B, that's in blue, and we've shown that in pounds rather than in kilowatt hours, partly because it means more to the residents when we talk about pounds and pence. And also I can put it into the same unit as for the period C. So as you can see, the blue is what they were using in period B. The salmon colour, the amber colour, is what they were using in period C. That was where they were paying on the meters, paying by their metered consumption, which switched on the billing. And as you can see, there's a significant drop in consumption. And the red lines below the line is the average savings. So you can see those savings are significant. And I should point out at this stage that actually we believe there was also a change in behavior between period A and B, because of course we were installing the meters, we were talking to the residents about what metering, how metering worked and what it was going to mean for them, metering and billing. So we believe that they actually reduced their consumption between these 2 periods, but also what I'm actually showing you on the graph is the difference in consumption between period B and period C. So what does that mean? So the results, all but 1 reduced their consumption. And all but 2 are paying less than the flat rate charge. So there's 2 here, I think there's 1 here and 1 here who are paying more than the actual flat rate charge. The average weekly saving between period B and C was £3.68. That's £191 per year. But the really important thing was the saving they made against their £500 a year. That's flat rate charge, the £960 a week. And after metering, they were paying £275 per year. That's a £45 reduction in costs. So as you can see, the actual effect of behavioural change is significant. The windows close, the thermostats are turned down, and the residents turn the heating off when they don't use it. And of course, all these savings mean less gas going into the boiler house, less energy going into the plant room. So I'm now going to move on and come back to that case study. But if we just consider the cost effectiveness tool at the moment on these next couple of slides, and I'm showing you the results of a cost effectiveness, the short cost effectiveness tool that we did for a site where at £1.5 per kilowatt hour, the actual result came out as false. This screenshot is of the results page of the cost effectiveness tool. If you want to know more about how the cost effectiveness tool works, I've actually put some links on here that take you to some previous webinars that we did where we stepped through how to complete the cost effectiveness tool. But if you increase the gas price to 3p, that's 100% increase. Bear in mind that the wholesale gas prices have gone up 250%. Then immediately the result of the cost effectiveness tool becomes true. So it moves from false to true, and your surplus or your net present value based on the 3.5% discount rate is over £6,000 for over that 10-year period. So it goes to true. If it goes up 150% to 3.75 pence per kilowatt hour, then you're making a surplus of £1,000, over £1,000 a year. And obviously it's true. So it's going to have a significant difference on a significant impact on the paybacks associated with installing meters. But I should point out at this stage that the CET tool uses 20% as the benefit or the reduction due to installing meters. And as you've seen from the case study I've just shown you, that the savings or the reduction in demand is significantly more than 20%. That 20% came from Bays. Bays put that into the tool based on a European study that was commissioned by the European Climate Change Committee, or and it's a pan-European figure. And obviously we can see that in UK residential social housing, that figure is much higher than 20%. In fact, it was 35% on the case study, the actual kilowatt hour reduction on the case study, and at the retirement home. But we see generally that reduction being near 50%, so 45%. And we've got case studies which we're happy to share with you, and indeed we've shared with Bays in the past, which evidence these savings. So in a way, that these tools are significantly, or the CET is significantly underestimating the benefit of installing meters. So just before I finish, what would this mean to the £9.60 flat rate charge? Well, if that went up by 150%, then the increase would be, the £9.60 would go to £24. With metering, the £5.28 would go up to £13.20. Now, these are only indicative figures, and it's just a rule of thumb, but it gives you the idea that actually, if you want to install metering, then the impact of the price increases. And the price increases, we're buying gas at the moment at 1.5 kilowatt hours, and the schemes that we buy gas for are locked in until December 22, but we're already seeing some of our clients seeing those increases in gas price coming through, and the recent one has actually gone up from something like 1.5p to 7p a kilowatt hour. But we think, I mean, we haven't got a crystal ball, but we are suspecting that we'll never see 1.5p a kilowatt hour again for commercial gas prices, that it's going to be nearer the 3p, 2, 3, 4p in the future, when we'll never go back to that. Takeaways: metering reduces costs and consumption. As energy price rises, prices rise, paybacks on metering become more attractive, and carbon emissions are reduced, and this can have an effect obviously on your EPCs. So we're going to have questions after Collins, and I've actually got my colleague Chloe Chandler on the call to answer questions specifically about the case studies. Chloe was very involved in this particular case study, so she'll give a hand with any specific questions. Thank you very much, Colin. I'll hand back to you.
Many thanks, Ian. That's very interesting. So what I'm going to talk about is, let's assume that it is viable to retrofit the meters. Then what should be done about it, and who's going to pay? So there's sort of three questions up there, as you'll see on the slides there. First of all, who has the duty to actually do all this? Secondly, who pays for the upgrade, and who might be able to get the money back if they are from the people who are benefiting from the system and from the upgrades, and what agreements make this happen. So if we can move on to the next slide. First of all, who has the duty? The key words there, and it is the heat supplier who has the duty, and that's a person who supplies and charges for the supply of heating, cooling, or hot water to a final customer. So the whole point is that this is the party who has the customer agreement, the heat supply agreement with the residents. On the slide there, I put that a final customer, and this is the definition in the regulations, is a person who purchases heating for their own end consumption from a heat supplier. So it's quite clear that the heat supplier is the person who has the contractual obligation to supply the heat and receives payment for it. Essentially, this means there's only one heat supplier, and so one has to go looking for who that might be. And in the two models that generally exist nowadays in relation to heating systems, those two models being the ESCO model and the what I call CEM, or the management model. ESCO being where everything is handed over to a heat supplier, to an ESCO. They do all the operation and maintenance, they handle all the metering and billing, and crucially, they have the relationship with the customers. Under the CEM model, the contractor does everything that has been described under the ESCO model. That is, they handle the operation and maintenance, they handle the metering and billing, but it is all done in the name of the employer. So they are essentially just the contractor making the employer's obligations or fulfilling the employer's obligations. And in those cases, it's the employer who has the agreement with the customers, and therefore they are the heat supplier. So that means that any housing association, build to rent operator, developer, management company who has got the agreements with the customers, they are the heat supplier, and they are the party who has the duty to give the considerations that we've been talking about today. So if we can move on to the next slide. I've set out there the basic agreements because they are essentially the basic agreements that make a scheme work. It's important to remember that each scheme is essentially a mini business, in the sense that somebody is supplying the service and somebody else, i.e. the customers, are paying for it. And the viability of each scheme therefore depends on the revenues coming in from the customers. Now, some heat businesses are very large, as we know, because they are ESCOs. They have a number of schemes on varying sites, and they have the financial muscle to do some cross subsidy, and therefore they're less dependent on one set of customers for paying for extraordinary expenses, such as upgrading meters or installing meters and things like that. Others, of course, are very small. They might be single site-based organizations, and their viability depends on just that one set of customers and nobody else. And so their viability is obviously quite different. Incidentally, I do get asked quite often whether it's possible to cross-subsidize across sites, particularly housing associations who hold a number of sites and are operating a number of schemes quite often on a standalone basis. I get asked, is it possible to cross-subsidize from one site to another? The answer actually is not totally straightforward, and therefore not something that can be easily dealt with in a seminar like this. But it depends largely on what the leases say. It also depends on the metering and billing regulations, and crucially also on the landlord and tenant legislation as it applies to that particular building. But opportunities can be there for cross-subsidy, and therefore for making sure that the meters, if they have to be installed in one area of the overall collection of schemes, there may be that possibility of some cross-subsidies in order to smooth out the costs. Because as I will show in a later slide, the costs probably can be collected through the heat tariffs from the residents themselves. Incidentally, the legislation that's being proposed, or at least the proposals for it, envisage that there will be super ESCOs, and these super ESCOs will be empowered to do things like cross-subsidize, and they will be the ones who have satisfied a number of consumer relationship criteria. And once they've qualified and shown that they have a certain size, they will be able to run the businesses more as one business as opposed to a collection of schemes. Right, okay, if we can move on to the next slide. So this is, if you're an ESCO, where might you be able to get your reimbursement from? And so I've put out the principal contracts for that are the master concession agreements and the supply agreements. So basically, what the ESCO agreement is saying is that we're going to provide heat, and we are the supplier. Back to the point that it's the ESCO that has the agreements with each of the residents. Well, who pays? Well, the customers, of course, pay through the tariffs, and the ESCO relies on the tariffs, both the standing charges and the variable charges, for the overall viability of that particular scheme. Developers, when they're granting the concession to an ESCO, and indeed not necessarily developers, but it can be a management company or, and other organizations who are granting this concession, quite naturally, they are not keen to take on any obligations themselves to pay for any matters relating to the running of the scheme. The idea is that the scheme has to stand on its own in order to be viable. So generally, one wouldn't look in a master concession agreement to see whether another party, in effect the party granting the concession, whether they can be made to contribute to the cost of the upgrade. So one therefore would look at the supply agreements. Now the price review mechanisms in supply agreements do vary quite a lot. Some actually are quite limiting and really only allow suppliers to review prices according to one of the indexes, such as CPI or RPI. Others have wording which is considerably wider than that, and essentially permit the supplier to review prices not only in relation to things like inflation, but also extraordinary costs. Some say only if there are levies. Others are wider than that and say if it can be demonstrated that the costs of running a scheme are extraordinarily higher than they were anticipated to be, then it's acceptable to pass on those costs to residents. There was probably going to be an element of benchmarking, but it nevertheless gives an element of flexibility, and it therefore may well be that the cost of upgrading for the supply agreements, for the meters, installation of meters, can be collected through the supply agreements. So if we can now, just one other thing actually, I just want to, before we move on, is the update a change in law? That's the last question at the bottom of the slide. There's a question here, actually. It's always been known that this part of the regulations would be brought into force. And essentially, the changes to the regulations could be regarded as a refinement rather than a change in the law. Now, change in law clauses in contracts generally are written and contain definitions, and they define what is meant by a change in the law. And some of them say that a change in the law is anything that wasn't anticipated. I'm summarizing, but anything that wasn't anticipated before the agreement came into being. And so it may well be that some people might challenge the entitlement to pass on the costs if one is relying on a change in the law clause. Of course, it may also be the case that the people who would be able to benefit from that in practice may not be very well versed in the workings of the contract. And so it may be possible to pass on the costs, albeit that technically people may be able to challenge it, but we will see as time goes by. Is the question of reimbursement if you're a party under a CEM model. So if we can have the next slide, please. So the principal contracts here are slightly different because there is no concession agreement, of course. And under the equivalent of the ESCO concession agreement is the agreement under which the developer or the management company says to the contractor, please do everything, but that crucial difference, but I'm still the party who has all the obligations. You are merely performing them for me. And so there's no concession agreement to look at, but the two agreements that one would look at would be the supply agreements and the leases. So under supply agreements, the situation is largely the same as I was describing for an ESCO model. Under the leases, of course, there's a general concept under leases that all of the costs of running the building will be covered by service charges. That's just a general consumption, a general assumption and concept. There are exceptions to it, but certainly leases will contain provisions which potentially permit landlords to recover through service charges extraordinary costs such as upgrading the system, which is what this would entail if meters have to be installed. Okay, so that brings me to the end of the talk. So what I'd like now to do is to open up for questions, and we've had quite a number of questions actually. So we'll try and get through them all. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to try and select one or two. Maybe we'll group them together. But starting from the top, first of all, interesting one actually. This is the competition between the short form and the longer one. So if the short form shows that something's viable, but the long one says that it's not, or vice versa, which one prevails? Tom, it's probably one for you. I can sort of take a guess, though, that the more reliable one is going to be the one where there is actual evidence. And therefore, that's the one probably that would prevail. But Tom, if you wouldn't mind having a go at answering that.
Yeah, I would say the one that's got the less assumptions is probably going to be the one that's more what we'd expect to see more of. I have been told by the people that made the forms that they should give the same result if the same information is put into both. So it'd be interesting to see if there is an example where you've got two different answers using the same sort of information. But I would say the one that's used the least assumptions is probably going to be the most accurate, for sure.
Yeah, and of course, if one therefore were to conclude from that one that there is no need to install meters, then obviously questions might be asked as to why meters aren't being installed, and therefore somebody would need to rely on that. And I would suggest that, as a lawyer, certainly, if you've got evidence, then that's going to be better than any of the assumptions that might be made from using the tool. So we had another question: will any support be given around communications for residents? Because there is a high level of, or could be a high level of pushback from residents when they're told that either meters are going to be installed, or potentially when they're told that meters aren't going to be installed. So I think, if I can just have a go at answering this first of all, I think I would say that first, there is quite a lot of information out there already. The communications to residents certainly need to be made as clear as possible, because they are these are complex rules, complex issues, and therefore somebody needs to give honest and accurate answers to questions that might be raised, but in a simplified form. But other than that, I would say it's probably down to parties to organise their own communications in the best way that suits their residents. Ian, I'd like to bring you in because obviously you've got some experience. We've had some experience of dealing with residents groups.
That's right. We've had a lot of experience of doing this, and indeed, in the case study, there was a lot of consultation going on. And one of the reasons that there was a three-period approach to it, in other words, they switched the meters on and then but didn't bill to start with, was because they were a little bit uneasy about the residents were a bit uneasy about what actually the effect would be. Again, that came out of the consultation, but we would see it as something that you should expect from your metering and billing supplier. It's certainly a service that we would offer, and we are always very involved in the tenant consultations, both in preparing documents and preparing literature, but also going to site and actually holding tenant consultations. We do that regularly. And it's something that you should be looking to your metering and billing provider to support you with, and certainly what we do. And we have a lot of case studies. I can talk to you offline if you want to talk to us about it. We can talk about how we've done it in a number of different scenarios. So yeah.
Great, thanks, Ian. Okay, I've just been looking at other questions, but I'll take them in order, and I think we'll endeavour to get through them all. But if we can't answer them all, then we'll send out our comments with the slides when they come out. Okay, so the next one is a question actually for Switch 2 and for Winkworth Sherwood. This is about the question of the leases. And if you've got pre-27th of November 2020 leases, and 10% of the building are covered by those, and also those leases essentially prevent a party from, or prevent the landlord from being able to collect payment for heat by consumption, then what is the best way of establishing whether or not the building is in the viable class or the exempt class? And that's really what the nub of the question is about, because one question is, which class am I in? And the other question is, if I'm in the open class, then I have to do the consideration. It's difficult to know what is going to be the more costly of the two exercises. But one thing that can be borne in mind is that one can move out of the exempt class if the percentage of leases changes. And therefore there may well come a time at which it becomes necessary to do the viability testing. But other than that, one has to just take a view as to whether or not it's a good idea to try and remain in the exempt class for as long as possible, or whether it's a good idea to actually just do the viability check first of all.
Yeah. I would also say that actually this cost effectiveness tool and this viability process is not mandatory. You don't have to do it. You can you could decide to install the meters based on the merits of installing meters. So this is not a mandatory exercise that you have to go through. You could just decide that actually on balance it would be the best thing to do to install meters.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, thanks, Ian. And actually, I think that answer probably deals with another question that we've had, which is a site-specific one concerning a building, a 1930s building, where the leases are pre-2020. The lease says that each lessee pays a percentage of the total costs for all the landlord services, and the number of long leases is over 10%. So that sounds to me as though it pretty well falls into the exempt class, but it can move out of the exempt class, and of course one does have to be very careful when interpreting leases in checking that the wording actually does mean what it appears to say, because leases are bespoke documents, and they all hang on the interpretation of the actual wording in the lease itself. Okay, so now there's one concerning the retirement complex in Hull. Would it be considered supported housing? I don't know how we can answer that question without knowing more about the particular building, because a retirement complex could take many different forms. And in fact, there's one very near to where I'm sitting right at the moment, in which it would not be regarded as falling into the kind of retirement complex that's envisaged by the rules. So if there is more specific information about a particular building, then the question can be answered. Another question here, I think this one's going to be for you, Tom, actually. Looks as though it might be a rap over the knuckles for you. It says, we've submitted a few notifications on behalf of multiple of our clients, but we've not received any acknowledgement or confirmation of the submission from OPSS. Can we therefore assume that everything was filed correctly and that we comply?
Yep, so we don't send out a notification. We don't send out acknowledgement of the notifications because in busy times we receive too many, and it would literally be someone's full-time job to deal with that. So we do have an auto response set up. So you should have got it for the first one. You may not have got it for subsequent ones. As long as it's been sent to the correct email address, you can assume we've got it. If you've got concerns that we haven't received it, you can just drop us an email and we can check. That's something we can easily do. Generally with notifications, once we've got it, we'll only contact you if we need to get further information or just to clarify some of the information that you've provided. But as standard, we don't send out acknowledgements currently.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Thanks for that. Just as an interest, a slightly aside, actually, the purpose of notification, I believe, when the regulations were first introduced, was so that it would be possible to build up a good profile of the heat installations that there are in the country, so that it would be possible to shape policy. Does that still remain the purpose, or are there sort of have other beneficial purposes been discovered as a result of the notification processes?
No, it's definitely the main purpose. It does inform a lot of work that our policy colleagues do, and analysing the heat network market, and a lot of the information that's come from the notifications has gone into work that's going towards the market framework, for example, that's coming soon, hopefully. It still remains the main purpose. We often have discussions about how else we can use this data, and we're currently having discussions about the possibility of whether we can share it more publicly, but they're in very early stages at the moment, so I wouldn't expect anything more on that for a while. But it is well within our thoughts that there is more we could do with the information we collect.
Brilliant, excellent. Well, I'm sure everybody would be very interested to actually to know what all those statistics are. So we'll keep watching. Now here's a question actually, which I think probably is for me, which is, am I right in saying that a housing association can't claw back the charges from installing the meters on sites where there are general needs residents, but it is possible to charge shared owners via the standing charges or the service charges? Now, I think this question goes really to this distinction between short leases and long leases. Essentially, leases that are 7 years and shorter are short leases, and there is a provision in the landlord and tenant legislation which says that it is not possible for the landlord to charge for the maintenance of the apparatus for heating. And so that would generally, just as a general overview, mean that landlords are precluded from passing on the costs of doing something to the meters of this nature. When it comes to the question of whether or not those costs can be passed on to shared ownership residents who will have leases that are obviously much longer than the 7 years, then the question is, again, it comes back to what does the lease say? The legislation itself won't be the place to look, but it will be what does the lease say, because that will determine what charges can be passed on to residents under the service charges.
Could I just debate the metering, the provision of the metering and billing service, of course, is usually seen as part of delivering the energy provision to the resident. And if you took that view, then maybe you could charge the provision of the metering within the to all the residents as part of the energy bill.
Yeah, I think if I've understood you correctly, and I think what you're saying is that it's part of the metering and the billing element, as opposed to the operation and maintenance element, then you could pass it on. And that's an interesting idea, which and it might be possible to work out an interpretation of the legislation that is the position. I think at first blush, one would probably say that anything to do with alteration to the physical system itself probably comes under operation and maintenance rather than the customer engagement elements of which metering and billing are part and which can be passed on. But it's an interesting idea, actually, and certainly one that should be looked at in a real life situation. Okay, let's see what else we've got. Yes, now I've got one here, actually. I think this could be for you, Tom, might be for Ian. We've got an issue with a meter that's in the process of being changed and therefore has no annual consumption. So therefore what should be submitted? The meter isn't likely to be exchanged in time for the deadline, and the billing team are unable to supply an estimated annual consumption. So therefore, should we be carrying out the long form? So it's probably, why don't you have a go first, Ian, answering that one? And then,
I assume we're talking about the main gas meter to a building here. Yeah, and I suppose it's whether or not you could go back to a period when the meter was working, if it ever worked. But I would say that if you don't have the readings, then you would potentially have to do the long form.
yeah. And any thoughts on that one, Tom?
What Tom's your?
Yeah. No, I would say if you don't have the exact readings, then you're going to have to look at the full cost effectiveness form, and just use the best guess you've got if you haven't got the readings, because I can't see any other way around it, to be honest.
Yeah. Okay. Now, there's an interesting one here. Does anyone have experience where the tenants are, I think it means being charged from a heat with rent scheme to a metered heat system? And could this be shared? Now, I think what that probably means is that the heating costs are covered as part of the rent, and then there's an intention to switch to a metered system.
Yeah.
I don't know if Ian and Tom.
Yeah, we have lots of experience of that, and we can. Yeah, I mean, we could talk to you about that and give you some of our case studies where this has happened, and yeah, so we've done a lot of this, and we'd be very happy to talk to you about it and share the experiences. Yeah. And put you in touch with our clients who have done it, if you would like to speak to the actual organizations who did it.
Yeah. Okay, so here's an interesting one, actually. So if there's a building where there are heat meters, but the majority of them no longer operate, then should a CET be undertaken for replacement, or does it fall outside that, or should the meters be replaced regardless? So that's one where I think probably I would suggest you would say that it is a building. Let's just say it's a building that doesn't have meters. So certainly a question needs to be, the question needs to be asked, I would venture. But Ian and Tom, you might have other thoughts on that.
So I would say that if it's already got meters installed on the network, then there's a requirement to make sure that those meters are accurate and correctly working. So I think that would override any obligations under cost effectiveness. So the meters would probably just need to be replaced, but without looking at it more carefully, I wouldn't want to give a more considered answer. But I think Regulation 5 and Regulation 7 is probably where you would need to be looking in the regs.
That would be our advice.
Okay, that's great. Right, now I think we've got to the end of the questions, actually.
There's one from Scott Rastrick. Would the retirement complex in Hull be considered supported housing? That's quite an interesting question. It probably would, but the owners of that building took the decision that the right thing to do was to put meters in anyway. But certainly we've installed a lot of meters into sheltered accommodation. Yeah, I think the definition of almshouses is fairly vague. So it's really up to I don't know what Tom would say, is up to the owner of the building to decide whether or not it falls into the assisted living criteria.
Yeah, I would say that supported housing descriptions in the regs, there's quite a lot of descriptions. They've been taken directly from another piece of legislation, as far as I'm aware. But generally, so with retirement housing, I think the key would be whether there's extra care or assistance given It's not just enough that it's retirement housing for supported living in that instance. There are extra bits in the regs that do kind of cover some of this. But if you've got a very specific example that you're not sure about, you can email us. But I think generally, if you have some sort of supported housing, you should be aware that it's supported housing, really, because you're doing something extra.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Well, look, that brings us to the end of the questions, and it also means that we've overrun by 6 minutes, for which apologies, because we're very well aware that everybody has jobs to do as well. So many thanks, Tom, and many thanks, Ian, for what's been interesting and lots of questions as we anticipated. Many thanks everybody for listening as well. As we said at the start, we will be sending out slides and a recording of this webinar. Once again, many thanks for attending, and look forward to the next one. Many thanks. Bye-bye.
Yep.
Thank you.